A grieving husband begged forgiveness until the lies cracked. The truth, abuse, poison, and attempted murder, erupted in a hospital hallway, exposing a predator behind charm. Survival demanded witnesses, evidence, and courage. Protecting mother and child meant exposing every bruise, every secret, every betrayal. A week after she supposedly lost her first child, she disappeared. We were heartbroken, until me and her husband Vince tracked her down and found her very much pregnant. When we cornered her in the hallway of the apartment she'd been renting, she froze. Her belly was unmistakably round, and she backed against her door with her hands protectively over her stomach. "Beth," I gasped, staring at her obviously pregnant belly. "What is going on? We've been looking for you for 2 months. You said you lost the baby." Vince fell to his knees right there in the hallway, sobbing like I'd never seen a man cry before. "Our baby's alive? Beth, our baby's alive? Why would you do this to me? I held you while you cried about losing our baby and it was all a lie. Please leave," Beth whispered, fumbling for her keys while keeping her back pressed to the door. "Please just go away." "I thought you were dead," Vince wailed, crawling toward her on his knees. "You disappeared and I thought you'd taken your life. Your family has been destroyed." We had a memorial service. We'd all cried at that service for the baby that would never be born. Mom had held. "How could you do this to us?" I asked Beth, feeling rage mixing with confusion. "Mom hasn't stopped crying since you left. Dad's been driving around at night looking for you." "I had to leave," Beth said, her voice barely audible. Vince was still on the floor reaching for her ankles. "I was the perfect husband. I took care of you after you lost the baby. I drove you to the doctor. I told everyone how brave you were. You've been hurting me for 2 years," Beth said suddenly, and the hallway went silent except for Vince's dramatic sobbing. "What?" I asked, but even as the word left my mouth I started remembering things. Beth wearing long sleeves in summer, the way she'd flinch when Vince touched her at family dinners, how she'd stopped being herself after the wedding. Beth was shaking now, pressing herself harder against the door. "He's been abusing me since our wedding night. No one would believe me because he's so charming in public. He's careful about where he grabs me, no one sees the bruises." "That's insane," Vince said. But his tears had stopped instantly. "Beth's having pregnancy hormones making her paranoid. She needs help." "You threw me down the stairs 3 months ago," Beth said to him. "You said you hoped I'd lose the baby because you didn't want to be tied down." I stared at Vince, who was now standing up, his grief completely gone. My mind raced back to that day Beth had called saying she'd fallen down the stairs. Vince had been so attentive at the hospital. Now I wanted to vomit. "She's obviously having some kind of breakdown," Vince said to me. "Pregnancy psychosis is real. We need to get her help." That's when Beth pulled out her phone with shaking hands and showed me a photo. It was a box of pills hidden in what looked like Vince's toolbox in their garage. "I found these 2 days before I faked the miscarriage," she said. "They're abortion pills. Misoprostol. He was going to put them in my food to make me lose the baby." "You're delusional," Vince said. But his face had gone pale. "I looked them up," Beth said, her voice stronger now. "The dose he had would have caused severe bleeding and miscarriage. He was going to poison me and our baby and make it look natural." I felt sick looking at the photo on her phone. This was my brother-in-law. The man who'd coached my son's little league team. "You were going to kill your baby?" "She's lying," Vince said, moving toward Beth. "She's mentally ill." "So I went to my OB appointment alone and came home and told him the doctor said I lost the baby," Beth said. "I cried for days to make it believable. Then I ran the second I could. I knew he wouldn't look for me because I gave him what he wanted, but I wasn't going to let him take this baby." Vince's mask was completely gone. His face twisted. "You stupid bitch. Do you know what you've put me through? The sympathy I had to pretend to accept? The grief I had to fake? You were going to kill us both eventually," Beth screamed. "I didn't want a baby and you just wouldn't shut up," Vince screamed. "And now you've humiliated me in front of everyone. They all think I'm some grieving father." I stepped between them as Vince moved toward Beth, my whole body shaking with rage. "Don't you touch her. Get out of my way," Vince snarled at me. "She's my wife." "Not anymore," Beth said. "Not ever again." Vince's face went purple with rage. "You think you can leave me? You think you can take my child? I'll kill you before I let that happen." That's when he grabbed me by the throat and threw me against the wall so hard my vision went black. I heard Beth screaming as he lunged for her pregnant belly. My back hit the wall hard and I slid down to the floor, pain shooting through my skull. Through my blurry vision I saw Vince's hands reaching for Beth's round belly while she swung her heavy purse straight at his face. The purse connected with his nose and he stumbled back cursing. Beth was screaming for help and a door opened down the hall. An older man stuck his head out and shouted that he was calling 911 right now. The neighbor rushed out in his pajamas carrying a baseball bat and pushed himself between Vince and Beth. Vince's whole face changed the second he saw the bat. His rage disappeared and suddenly he looked confused and worried. He started saying Beth had attacked him first and that she was having some kind of mental breakdown during her pregnancy. The neighbor wasn't buying it and kept the bat raised while Beth pressed herself against her apartment door sobbing. I tried to, but the room was spinning and I had to grab the wall to stay upright. Sirens were already getting louder outside and Vince was backing away from the neighbor, switching to his charming voice saying this was all a big misunderstanding. Within minutes the hallway filled with paramedics who immediately separated everyone. One EMT knelt beside me checking my head where it hit the wall while another went straight to Beth. She was holding her stomach and begging them to check if her baby was okay. The EMT with Beth started asking about contractions and if she felt any bleeding while checking her pulse. 2 more paramedics were keeping Vince back and he was putting on a show about being worried about his wife. Police officers arrived right as they were helping me onto a stretcher. One officer rode with me in the ambulance asking basic questions but my head was pounding and I couldn't think straight. Through the ambulance doors I saw them loading Beth into another ambulance with an officer climbing in beside her. Beth kept repeating over and over that Vince had tried to kill her baby. The ride to the hospital felt like forever with the EMT shining a light in my eyes and asking me to follow his finger. At the emergency room a nurse named Caitlin Novak took over, cleaning the bump on my head and checking for signs of concussion. Beth had been rushed straight to obstetrics and I kept insisting I was fine and needed to be with my sister. Caitlin explained I had to complete the concussion check first for my own safety. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I sat on the exam bed waiting for any news about Beth and the baby. Detective Omar Velasquez showed up while I was still in the ER and pulled up a chair beside my bed. He had a notebook out and asked me to walk him through everything that happened. I showed him the photo on Beth's phone of the abortion pills hidden in Vince's toolbox. He took pictures of the bruises already forming on my neck where Vince had grabbed me. The detective asked detailed questions about what Vince had said and done, writing everything down carefully. After what felt like hours, the OB doctor finally came out to the waiting area. She said Beth's baby appeared stable, but she was having stress contractions they were monitoring closely. Beth was asking for me so they let me go sit with her once my concussion check cleared. She was hooked up to multiple monitors with straps across her belly tracking the baby's heartbeat. Tears were streaming down her face but this time they were relief that the steady beeping meant her baby was still okay. A woman named Abigail Cooper arrived introducing herself as a domestic violence advocate from the hospital. She sat with us and helped Beth understand her options for getting an emergency protective order. We filled out paperwork right there in the hospital bed with Beth documenting 2 years of abuse. Abigail explained the order would require Vince to stay away immediately once approved by a judge. Beth's hand shook as she wrote down dates and incidents she could remember. I had to step out to the waiting room to call our parents, and my stomach was in knots. Mom answered on the first ring already worried because I hadn't checked in. When I tried to explain everything that happened she broke down crying. She kept switching between relief that Beth was alive and horror about what Vince had been doing to her. Dad got on the phone and his voice sounded completely broken when he said they were driving over immediately. While I was still in the waiting room my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was the apartment manager calling me back after Detective Velasquez had contacted him about security footage. He confirmed their hallway cameras should have caught the whole attack on video. His voice was shaking when he said he had no idea Beth had been living there under a fake name. He was pulling the footage right now to send to the detective. I went back to Beth's room where she was still hooked to monitors but looking calmer. The baby's heartbeat filled the room with its steady rhythm, and we both just sat there listening to it. Everything had happened so fast, but at least Beth and her baby were safe for now. My phone started buzzing around 6 in the morning with text after text from Vince. I grabbed it from the nightstand in the hospital room where I'd been dozing in the chair next to Beth's bed. The messages kept coming, one after another, each one more crazy than the last. He was saying Beth had pregnancy psychosis and needed psychiatric help immediately. He claimed he was the real victim here, and that Beth had been planning this whole thing for months to get custody advantage in their divorce. His text said she'd been secretly recording him and taking photos of herself to frame him for abuse. I screenshotted every single message before blocking his number because I knew we'd need them as evidence. Beth was still sleeping with the monitors beeping steadily, so I stepped into the hallway to call Mom and tell her which hospital we were at. Within an hour, our parents rushed through the door of Beth's room, and Mom practically collapsed when she saw Beth's pregnant belly under the hospital blanket. Her legs gave out, and Dad had to catch her as she started sobbing harder than I'd ever seen. Dad kept apologizing to Beth over and over when she woke up, saying he was sorry for not seeing the signs, and for inviting Vince to all those family dinners. Beth just held their hands and cried while the baby's heartbeat filled the room from the monitor. Mom couldn't stop touching Beth's belly and asking if the baby was really okay after everything that happened. Around noon, Detective Velasquez came back to the hospital room with an update that made us all breathe a little easier. He told us they'd arrested Vince on assault charges from last night's attack on me and Beth. Vince was being held at the county jail pending a bail hearing that would probably happen in the next few days. The detective also said they were getting a search warrant for Vince's house to look for those abortion pills Beth had photographed. He warned us that Vince would likely make bail within days since he had no prior record and strong community ties. Abigail came by after lunch to help us create a detailed safety plan for when Vince got released from jail. We sat around Beth's hospital bed with notebooks and went through everything step by step. She helped us pick code words we could text if we were in danger and made a list of emergency contacts we should all have in our phones. We talked about how Beth needed a new safe place to stay since Vince knew about her apartment now. Abigail said I'd need to have a hard conversation with my son about not talking to Uncle Vince anymore if he showed up at the school or baseball practice. We made plans for Beth to change her phone number and delete all her social media accounts. That afternoon, a court clerk came to the hospital with paperwork saying the emergency protective order had been approved by a judge. The order required Vince to stay at least 500 feet away from all of us, including my son. The hospital security team added Vince's photo to their watch list and put an alert on Beth's room that no information could be given out about her. I still jumped at every noise in the hallway and checked the door constantly. The next morning, a CPS worker showed up to assess the situation since violence had occurred during pregnancy, and my son had been mentioned as witnessing the aftermath. She was kind but asked a lot of detailed questions about Beth's prenatal care and her plans for after the baby was born. Beth had to explain why she'd been using a fake name at all her OB appointments for the past 2 months. The worker took notes about everything and said she'd need to do a home visit once Beth was discharged to wherever she'd be staying. 2 days later, I had to go to the courthouse for Vince's bail hearing, and it made me sick to see him. He showed up in an expensive suit looking like the perfect grieving husband with his hair neatly combed and this sad expression on his face. His lawyer argued that Vince wasn't a flight risk because he had deep community ties through coaching youth sports and running a local business. The prosecutor brought up the pills and the assault charges, but the judge still set bail at $50,000. The conditions included no contact with any of us and GPS ankle monitoring, but I knew that wouldn't stop someone like Vince if he really wanted to hurt Beth. When I got back to the hospital, Beth's OB doctor was there examining her, and the news wasn't good. She documented that Beth was having stress-related complications that could trigger early labor if she didn't rest completely. The doctor put Beth on modified bed rest and said she couldn't go back to her apartment or be alone. We decided Beth would move into my guest room since she needed help and couldn't risk being by herself. My son was confused when I picked him up from the school and told him Aunt Beth would be living with us for a while. I tried to explain that she needed our help with the baby, but he kept asking why Uncle Vince wasn't taking care of her. 3 days after Beth moved in, Detective Velasquez called with an update that changed everything. They'd executed the search warrant and found the abortion pills hidden in Vince's toolbox exactly where Beth said they would be. The detective said they also found receipts showing Vince had bought them online using cryptocurrency to try to hide the purchase. The forensics team discovered he'd been researching dosages and how to cause a miscarriage for weeks before Beth found the pills. This evidence meant the attempted poisoning charge would stick and made the case much more serious than simple assault. Meanwhile, my whole life was falling apart trying to juggle everything. I'd taken time off work to help Beth get to her appointments and deal with all the legal stuff, but my boss was getting frustrated with my absences. He called me into his office and said I needed to figure out my personal situation because the team was suffering without me there. My son's school called because he'd been acting out in class and getting in fights at recess, which he'd never done before. The counselor said he was probably reacting to all the stress and confusion at home with Beth, suddenly living with us, and Vince disappearing from his life. Everything felt like it was falling apart while we tried to hold it together and keep Beth and the baby safe. The hospital called us about a support group meeting for domestic violence survivors that Wednesday afternoon. Beth didn't want to go at first, but Abigail convinced her it might help. We walked into a small conference room where 8 other women sat in a circle of folding chairs. The facilitator asked everyone to share if they felt comfortable. A woman named Sarah talked about her husband who everyone loved at church but broke her ribs twice. Another woman described how her boyfriend was the fun guy at parties who held her head under water in the bathtub. Each story made my stomach turn as I recognized the same pattern, the charming public face hiding a monster at home. Beth finally spoke up about Vince and the abortion pills. The other women nodded like they understood completely. One said her ex had tampered with her birth control. Another said hers had pushed her downstairs too. I sat there realizing how many warning signs I'd missed over 2 years. The way Beth stopped wearing makeup. How she'd cancel plans at the last minute. The time she looked scared when her phone rang. After the meeting, Curtis Atkinson from the prosecutor's office met us in the hospital lobby. He wore a gray suit and carried a thick folder with Vince's name on it. He explained the charges included assault, attempted poisoning, and violating a protective order. The evidence was strong, but he warned us these cases could drag on for months. Beth would probably have to testify if Vince didn't take a plea deal. She grabbed my hand when he said that. Curtis showed us photos of the pills they'd found in Vince's toolbox. The forensics team had matched them to the ones in Beth's photo. He said this was crucial evidence of premeditation. That Friday we had dinner at Mom and Dad's house for the first time since everything happened. Beth picked at her food while Dad kept apologizing. He admitted he'd seen bruises on Beth's arms last summer. She'd said she fell gardening, and he believed her. Mom remembered Beth canceling Thanksgiving at the last minute. Vince had called saying Beth was sick, but Mom heard yelling in the background. She thought they were just having marriage problems. We all sat there drowning in guilt about what we'd ignored. Saturday morning, Vince's parents called my phone. His mother was crying and begging to talk to Beth. She said their son needed help, not prison. His father got on and offered to pay all of Beth's medical bills if she dropped the charges. They'd get Vince into therapy and make sure he never contacted her again. Beth took the phone and told them no. Her voice shook, but she was firm. After she hung up, she threw up in my bathroom. She couldn't believe they were taking his side after everything. Monday, Detective Velasquez called with news about the hallway footage. The apartment manager had found the recording from that night. It captured everything, including Vince screaming he'd killed Beth and the baby. The audio was crystal clear. Detective Velasquez said this was the best evidence they could hope for. It showed intent and removed any doubt about what happened. I asked if I could see it and immediately wished I hadn't. Watching Vince throw me against that wall made me sick. Seeing him lunge at Beth's pregnant belly was even worse. That night I couldn't sleep and started scrolling through old text messages from Beth. I found ones from months ago where she'd written things like, "Vince gets so angry sometimes." Another said, "I don't know what to do anymore." One from last year said, "I'm scared," but didn't explain why. I'd responded telling her to try counseling. I'd sent her articles about communication and relationships. She'd been begging for help and I'd given her useless advice. The guilt made me want to scream. 3 weeks after the attack, Beth woke me up at 2 in the morning. She was having contractions and could barely stand. We rushed to the emergency room where they hooked her up to monitors. The contractions were 4 minutes apart and getting stronger. The doctor gave her medication to stop them but said her stress levels were dangerous. She needed complete rest or the baby would come too early. Beth was only 30 weeks pregnant. While she was in the hospital, Vince violated the protective order. His GPS monitor showed him driving past my house at 3 in the morning. The monitoring company alerted police immediately. They arrested him at his parents' house where he'd been staying. His lawyer claimed it was an accident and he'd gotten lost. The judge didn't buy it. She warned him one more violation would revoke his bail completely. Detective Velasquez called with more evidence the forensics team had found. They'd traced the abortion pills to a website based overseas. Vince had used cryptocurrency to try hiding the purchase. His computer showed months of searches about causing miscarriages. He'd looked up dosages and methods and how to make it look natural. He'd even searched whether autopsy could detect the pills. This proved he'd been planning to poison Beth for months before she found the pills. Curtis met with us again to discuss a plea deal. Vince would plead guilty to assault and attempted poisoning. He'd serve 3 years in prison with 5 years probation after. He'd have no contact with Beth or the baby forever. Beth struggled with whether 3 years was enough. He'd terrorized her for 2 years and tried to kill their baby. But Curtis explained trials were hard on victims and this guaranteed prison time. We had a week to decide what Beth wanted to do. That Friday after school, my son climbed into the car and asked why Uncle Vince couldn't come to his baseball games anymore. I gripped the steering wheel and tried to find words that wouldn't scare him. I told him sometimes grown-ups hurt each other and need to stay apart to be safe. He asked if Aunt Beth's baby was okay. And I promised him we were keeping them both safe. He nodded and went back to playing with his action figures. But I saw him looking at Beth differently at dinner that night. The medical bills started piling up on Beth's kitchen counter and she'd sit there sorting them into piles she couldn't pay. She'd lost her insurance when she left Vince and had been paying cash for all her prenatal appointments. The stack grew taller every day. And I watched her hand shake as she opened each new envelope. Mom suggested we start a GoFundMe and within 2 hours of posting it we had $500. By the next morning it hit $3,000 and by the second day we'd raised over $5,000. Friends from high school, co-workers, even people we didn't know were donating and leaving messages of support. Beth cried reading every single comment and for the first time in weeks she smiled a real smile. 3 days later, Curtis called with bad news about Vince's lawyer filing a motion. They were claiming Beth had fabricated all the evidence and that the abortion pills were for legitimate medical purposes. The motion demanded her complete medical records going back 5 years, looking for any history of mental illness or instability. Abigail met us at the prosecutor's office and explained this was standard defense tactics to discredit victims. She said they'd subpoena everything they could to make Beth look crazy or vindictive. Curtis said we'd fight every single request, but warned us some records would have to be released. Beth sat there rubbing her belly and I could see her shutting down again. The guilt about not protecting Beth was eating me alive, so I finally made an appointment with a therapist. The first session I just sat there and cried for 20 minutes before I could even speak. She handed me tissues and waited until I could explain about missing all the signs and failing my sister. She helped me understand that abusers are experts at hiding their violence and manipulating everyone around their victims. She said families almost never see it coming because abusers are so good at maintaining their public image. It helped to hear, but the guilt still sat heavy in my chest every time I looked at Beth. After 2 more weeks of back and forth with lawyers, Beth decided she couldn't handle a trial while pregnant. The stress was already causing contractions, and her doctor said she needed to minimize anxiety for the baby's safety. Curtis assured us that 3 years in prison plus 5 years probation was actually significant for these charges. Vince would also have to register as a violent offender, which would follow him forever. Beth signed the paperwork with tears running down her face, but said she just wanted it over. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following week at the county courthouse. We arrived early and sat in the hallway waiting for our case to be called. Vince showed up in a suit with his parents and his lawyer, not even looking our direction. When we entered the courtroom, the judge explained what would happen and asked Vince to stand. His lawyer handed him a prepared statement, and Vince read it in a flat, emotionless voice. He admitted to assaulting me in the hallway and attempting to poison Beth's unborn child with illegally obtained abortion medication. Beth gripped my hand so tight I thought she might break my fingers. His voice never changed as he read the words like he was ordering lunch. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. 2 weeks before Beth's due date, we met with hospital security to create a safety plan for the birth. They took Vince's photo and added it to their restricted access list. They flagged Beth's chart so no information could be given out over the phone or to visitors. We created a password system where only people who knew the code word could get updates or visit. The security guard showed us the special entrance we'd use and gave us direct phone numbers to call. They explained the maternity ward had controlled access, but they'd add extra protocols for Beth's delivery. The baby would be born with protection already in place. At the sentencing hearing, Beth stood at the podium with her victim impact statement shaking in her hands. She talked about how Vince had stolen 2 years of her life through fear and violence. She described missing family events because she couldn't hide the bruises, losing friends because Vince isolated her, and living in constant terror in her own home. She talked about finding the pills and knowing he planned to kill their baby. The judge listened without interrupting, occasionally writing notes. When Beth finished, she walked back to sit beside me and I could feel her whole body trembling. Then it was my turn to give my statement about that night in the hallway. I described failing my sister when she needed me most and promised to never ignore warning signs again. I talked about the moment Vince's mask fell off completely, and I saw who he really was. I described him throwing me against the wall and lunging at Beth's pregnant belly with murder in his eyes. The courtroom was silent except for Mom crying softly in the gallery behind us. When I sat down, the judge looked directly at Vince and spoke for 10 minutes about domestic violence and the damage it causes. She sentenced him to 3 years in state prison plus 5 years probation after release. He'd have to complete a batterer's intervention program and would have a lifetime protective order keeping him away from Beth and the baby. The bailiffs moved forward and put Vince in handcuffs while his parents sobbed in their seats. His mother called out his name but he didn't turn around. Beth didn't look back as we left the courthouse, just kept walking forward into the bright afternoon sun. A week later Beth's water broke while we were eating breakfast and I drove her to the hospital while she gripped the door handle through contractions. The security guard at the maternity ward entrance checked our IDs against his list before buzzing us through the locked doors. Beth had pre-registered under a fake last name for extra safety and only immediate family knew which hospital we'd chosen. The nurses hooked her up to monitors while I held her hand and tried not to panic every time she screamed through another contraction. After 6 hours of labor, the doctor said she wasn't progressing fast enough and suggested walking the halls to speed things up. We did laps around the maternity floor for 2 more hours with Beth stopping to lean against the wall every few minutes when the pain hit. The baby's heart rate dropped during one bad contraction and suddenly the room filled with nurses checking monitors and adjusting Beth's position. They got it stabilized but kept her on oxygen after that just to be safe. 4 hours later Beth was finally ready to push and I stood by her head coaching her breathing like we'd practiced. She pushed for almost 2 hours before Hope finally arrived, screaming and perfect at 7 pounds even. Beth sobbed when they placed the baby on her chest and I took about 50 pictures while the nurses cleaned them both up. The next morning the CPS workers showed up with paperwork to close their case since Beth and Hope were both safe and healthy. She brought pamphlets about support groups and counseling services and made sure Beth understood all her legal options going forward. Beth signed the custody papers right there in the hospital bed, establishing that Vince had no parental rights while incarcerated. 2 days later we brought Hope home to my house where I'd set up the spare bedroom as a nursery. My son kept asking to hold his baby cousin and wanted to help with every diaper change and feeding. He'd run to get blankets or bottles whenever Hope cried and drew pictures to hang over her crib. Beth started therapy twice a week with someone who specialized in domestic violence survivors while I watched Hope. She'd come home from those sessions looking exhausted but somehow lighter, like she was slowly putting down heavy weights she'd been carrying. The therapist taught her grounding techniques for panic attacks and helped her process not just the abuse but the strength it took to escape. 3 months after Hope was born, Beth got approved for a transitional housing apartment through a program for abuse survivors. We spent every weekend painting the walls soft yellow and assembling furniture from yard sales and thrift stores. Mom found a barely used crib at a church sale and Dad refinished an old dresser from their garage. The day Beth moved in, Dad spent 6 hours installing new deadbolts and a security system with cameras at every entrance. He programmed it so alerts would go to his phone too if anything triggered the motion sensors after dark. Mom filled Beth's freezer with labeled containers of soup and casseroles and came over every morning that first week to help. Beth went back to work part-time at the office job she'd had before Vince made her quit. Her old boss had kept her position open hoping she'd come back someday, though he didn't know the full story. She worked mornings while Mom watched Hope and slowly rebuilt the career Vince had destroyed with his controlling behavior. Her co-workers noticed she was different now, jumping at sudden noises and always sitting where she could see the door. She earned her own money for the first time in years and opened a savings account Vince couldn't access even when he got out. At Hope's 6-month checkup, the doctor said she was hitting every milestone perfectly despite the stress during pregnancy. Beth started crying right there in the exam room when the doctor said Hope showed no signs of developmental delays. We sat in my car afterward while Beth processed that they'd both survived and were actually going to be okay. She kept repeating that Hope was perfect and healthy and safe, like she couldn't quite believe it was real. I started going to a support group for family members of abuse survivors that met Wednesday nights at the community center. Other siblings shared stories about missing warning signs and feeling guilty for not protecting their loved ones sooner. The facilitator helped us understand that abusers are experts at hiding their violence and manipulating everyone around their victims. We learned how to support survivors without taking over their lives or making decisions for them. I met another sister whose brother-in-law had nearly killed her sister, and we'd text each other when the guilt got overwhelming. Beth and her therapist started planning for when Vince would get out in 2.5 years. They made lists of safety measures and discussed whether staying in town with family support was better than starting fresh somewhere new. Our cousin in Oregon offered to help Beth relocate if she decided to leave, but Beth wasn't ready to make that choice yet. The therapist said having a plan would help Beth feel more in control even if she ended up changing it later. 6 months went by before my son asked the question I'd been dreading while we were building blocks on the living room floor with Hope crawling between our towers. "Is Uncle Vince ever coming back to coach baseball?" he asked without looking up from his blocks, and I set down the piece I was holding to think about my answer. I told him some people hurt others and have to stay away to keep everyone safe, and that Uncle Vince was one of those people who needed to stay away. He nodded like that made perfect sense and went back to stacking blocks while Hope knocked them down, and we both laughed at her determination. A year after the attack, Beth stood at a podium in the community center speaking to a room full of women about what happened to her. She talked about finding the abortion pills and how Vince had tried to poison their baby and how reproductive coercion was another form of abuse that people didn't talk about enough. Her voice stayed steady as she explained how she faked the miscarriage to escape and protected her baby by running and hiding for months. 3 women came up to her afterward with tears in their eyes saying she'd given them courage to leave their own situations, and Beth hugged each one of them. When we got home that night, Beth was exhausted, but lighter somehow, like sharing her story had taken some of the weight off her shoulders. We marked the anniversary of the attack quietly the next month, with just family at my house eating takeout and watching Hope toddle around the living room. Beth had a bad morning where she checked every lock 3 times and jumped when the mailman knocked, but by afternoon she was laughing at Hope trying to feed Dad her crackers. That's what recovery looked like for her, with bad moments and good ones all mixed together and all of us learning to accept both as normal. Through her support group, Beth met another woman named Sarah who'd escaped with her 2 kids after years of abuse, and they clicked immediately. They started taking their kids to the park together every Tuesday morning and texted each other daily check-ins about how they were doing. Sarah understood without Beth having to explain why she always sat facing the entrance or why sudden noises made her flinch, and having that understanding meant everything. Their kids played together while they talked about lawyers and custody and healing, and sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence watching their children be carefree. 2 years passed and Beth got promoted to the office manager at her job with a salary that finally let her feel secure on her own. Hope was a confident toddler who ran everywhere and talked non-stop and knew she was loved by so many people who would always protect her. Beth moved to a bigger apartment with a real bedroom for Hope, and we spent a weekend painting it purple because that was Hope's favorite color that week. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was at work, and Beth's voice was shaking when she told me Vince would be released in 6 months. We immediately called the advocate and updated all the safety plans, and Beth had to decide whether to leave town or stay with our support system. After a week of discussions with her therapist, Beth decided she wasn't going to run again because she wasn't the same scared woman who'd fled 2 years ago. We upgraded security systems and made sure Hope's daycare had updated photos of Vince and clear instructions that he was never allowed near her. Beth started teaching self-defense classes at the community center on Saturday mornings, turning her trauma into something that could help others. She showed women how to break holds and where to strike to get away, but mostly she taught them to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. Every woman who left her class knowing how to protect herself felt like Beth was taking back some of the power Vince had stolen from her. One quiet Sunday morning, I watched Beth pushing Hope on the swing at the park near my house with both of them laughing as Hope shouted, "Higher, Mama, higher." The sun was shining, and other families were playing around us, and for a moment everything felt normal and peaceful. We were different people now with more awareness of danger and more protective instincts, but also more grateful for these simple moments of joy. Our family had survived something terrible and came out stronger on the other side, and watching Beth and Hope together, I knew we were finally truly safe and genuinely happy.